Content warning: discussions of violence, torture, and death that some people may find disturbing.
Welcome to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. This is episode 4, Witch John. This episode is dedicated to Mary Potts. Ralph Gardiner writes, "When the sergeants had brought the said witch-finder on horseback to town, the magistrates sent their bellman through the town, ringing his bell and crying, 'All people that would bring in any complaint against any woman for a witch, they should be sent for and tried by the person appointed.' After this, the witch pricker left Newcastle and went to Northumberland to try witches there, but Henry Ogle was suspicious and went after the witch pricker as he was not certain he was true." Ralph Gardiner then says, "The said witch-finder was laid hold on in Scotland, cast into prison, indicted, arraigned, and condemned for such like villainy exercised in Scotland, and upon the gallows he confessed he had been the death of above 220 women in England and Scotland, for the gain of 20 shillings apiece, and beseeched forgiveness. And he was executed."
Welcome back to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. Thank you for joining us today. For this episode, we are joined by Katie Liddane, who is going to talk to us about the notorious Scottish witch pricker. Her research concerns the history and heritage of witch trials in the northeast of England from 1649 to 1673, starting with the Newcastle witch hunt of 1649 to 50 and the Derwentdale accusations of 1673. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, Katie.
So, Katie has been someone who's kind of been involved in this since the beginning. She was someone I met kind of early on and chatted to, and she's been very incredibly helpful with the research and kind of reading into the trials and everything. So thank you, first of all, Katie, for bringing that over to us, because not sure how we would have got some of the information or known where to look if you hadn't have helped out.
No, I'm happy to. I'm happy that it's the trials are being talked about kind of more publicly outside of my thesis and journal articles and things. That was kind of why I started my PhD. I wanted the trials to be recognised.
Katie, so if you don't mind me asking, so what is a witch pricker for our listeners?
So a witch pricker as a title would have been used fairly interchangeably with witchfinder, but it looking at it from today, it actually does go a bit more specific than that. And it is kind of a role that it does what it says on the tin. It's someone who pricks witches. The pricking refers to the testing of the devil's mark on the witch's body. From records, we're fairly sure that it would have been moles, warts, extra nipples, things like that were interpreted as a kind of physical manifestation of the pact with the devil. And this would be, in a lot of cases, the point at which the witch's familiar, which was an animal that was kind of the embodiment of the devil's power that he was sharing with the witch, would feed from her. So that's why in records it's sometimes referred to as a teat of kinds too. And the logic with pricking it, usually with what's called a bodkin, which is a kind of medical pin from the period that would usually be used to kind of pop blisters and boils and things like that.
Oh.
The pin would be inserted into the devil's mark with the logic that if it was a devil's mark and if this person was a witch, it wouldn't bleed because the devil was protecting that source of power.
Right. But obviously we know sometimes when you kind of prick marks and that like that, they don't necessarily bleed.
Yeah, especially when they can be kind of insensitive, or not have much blood supply, like certain warts and skin tags and things like that. And there's also speculation that the witchfinder might have either not been putting the pin into the skin at all, or we have evidence in Scotland of retractable pins.
Yeah.
So as you push the pin against the skin, it's not actually sharp, but the handle of the bodkin moves and takes the pin inside instead. So it looks like it's going a few inches into the body and there's no bleeding happening. And obviously two people observing this from like far back in a court setting, that looks physically impossible.
Yeah.
That there's something supernatural going on. It would be the witch's mark that they were looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, by and large, they would look for anything that they could call an unusual or unnatural mark on the body, say that this is possibly a witch's mark, and that's what they would be using pricking to test for. Yeah, there is the trend as cases escalate in a kind of regional or local setting, and as witch hunting peaked in the early 1640s, there is an observable trend of them being in increasingly more intimate places.
Right.
So you'll see records of them being referenced to as like the secret parts or privy places and things like that, which kind of really intensifies both the kind of humiliation and horror of public witch pricking, but also the kind of sexual undercurrents and the like very like gendered elements of witch hunting and the female body, and general suspicion of what was seen at the time as spiritually and physically weaker also meant more vulnerable to like corruptive influences, I suppose.
Yeah.
And that's why you see having carnal knowledge of the devil pop up in witchcraft cases generally, and the local cases that we're here talking about.
I guess one of the sort of, not a rabbit hole, but something that is heavily debated in lots of theories, and you could end up going down a few rabbit holes, is the witch pricker. And if anybody does a sort of search right now on the internet, there'll be a few names and a few theories banded about. We want to see if we can find out who this man was, maybe not definitively, but at least talk about who he could have been. And how do you get away with killing so many people?
Right, I do actually have my list of candidates with me.
Yes, let's hear them.
Katie has a wonderful notebook, and I see
that
it's
is a lot
full
of
writing.
notes. That we'd love to see.
So, there were quite a few Scottish witchfinders active in the 17th century, and as you say, that's without kind of taking into account clergymen or people that are called in the database of Scottish witchcraft. They're called investigators. So narrowing it down to just people that we know were prickers, we've got John Bain, John Balfour, Alexander Boggs, George Cathy, David Cowan, Thomas Crawford, John Dick, John Kincaid, James Patterson, and James Scobie.
You mentioned clergy and investigators. Sort of, what qualifications did these witch prickers have? Were they like actual clergymen going around pricking, or was they theological or doctors, or did they just announce themselves as a witch pricker?
I was about to say none of the above, really.
Okay.
It's kind of operated mainly by reputation. So we don't really get a sense for the vast majority of witch prickers out there how they started. We kind of pick up a bit like later on into their career. For example, Alexander Boggs, who we know was active in 1649, but this was on the northwest coast of Scotland, so not really close to be sent for in Newcastle. In records about him, he's described as being often sent for.
Okay.
So that's where we see it. He's already got a reputation and experience and a lot of witches on his CV, I suppose is how would be the equivalent today. But kind of the exception, and a man that is the exception generally in the history of English witchcraft, Matthew Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
He was a lawyer before. So there was kind of more of a solid background in criminal investigation with him. So when you were talking about how did the Newcastle Witchfinder get away with killing so many people, we'll probably get into this a bit later, but he claimed it was around 220 men and women across England and Scotland. Yeah. That's reportedly what he said on the gallows before he was hanged.
That's a lot of people to kill.
Definitely, yeah. And what probably would have been a relatively short-lived career as well. So we're not talking about, like with Hopkins, we're not talking about like decades of time. We're talking about probably about 3 to 5 years. Because it is so inexplicable. People have just tried to use the money angle to understand it in a way.
Yeah.
Like you hear a lot the kind of 20 shillings per witch, and they just kind of explain it away in a functional sense, in the same way that people say that witchcraft accusations can be explained away through neighbourly arguments and things like that. But I think it goes much deeper than that. So if we're being generous to the Newcastle Witchfinder and people like Hopkins and the Scottish witch prickers, we could talk about it in terms of spiritual righteousness and him seeing himself as a kind of crusader against the devil and an avenging angel in a way, defending communities from witches, from agents of the devil, and this Civil War period seen as sort of an apocalyptic time, visions of the end of the world and witches and demons walking the earth. So if he was what we'd see today as a religious radical, you can interpret it in that sense. That goes kind of a little bit deeper than the idea that he was just on the make. But I think, as is often the case in history, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is definitely what would be like an unrecognisable mindset to us today. But faith was so important to these people at the time, and they did believe in the kind of direct intervention of God and the devil in earthly matters. So, like you say, if God wasn't preventing this from happening, and if things like harvest crises and sickness and things like that were seen to have been eased in coincidence with a witch trial, they would be interpreting that as a message. So maybe the Witchfinder felt that God was allowing him and encouraging him to succeed. Yeah, especially with such conviction as well, to kind of see people suffering in such a way, like in witch trials, like the actual trials themselves and the mass hangings and stuff, and to still see that and think that a righteous thing has been done. I think we'd really struggle to find a parallel to that today. So to go through some of the other candidates, because I did start talking about how could they've been allowed to get away with this for so long. Yeah. That brings me on to John Balfour, one of the first candidates in my list. And I've kind of been able to rule him out because he was just asked to stop in 1632.
Just asked him, they said
just asked by authorities to stop pricking witches, just leave him alone. Just he was just asked to stop and sent on his way. And that's kind of the last we really hear of him as a witch pricker. Yeah.
At least he didn't kill more people.
It's really hard to... Well, he might have. We don't we don't really know, but...
He doesn't show up on like any records anywhere else.
Not
he's like, well,
else,
I'm relocating then.
Yeah, he might have become like Patrick Balfour instead and gone on to do more. But yeah, he was just asked to stop, and then we lose him in the records. Similarly, like David Cowan, he's not active until 1678. James Patterson up in Inverness in the 1660s. I've been factoring in the distance in my discussions of how would they hear of him to send for him in the first place.
Exactly. I can't even imagine they would think like, oh, Inverness, they have that guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's how I've been able to rule him out too. With some of the candidates, we do get a bit of an idea of how they might have become a witchfinder. So for Thomas Crawford, for example, he was active in 1649 and he was operating in a town north of Edinburgh, but he was originally a witness to a confession.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
So he was kind of involved in the judicial process and then elevated his way up to becoming a witchfinder himself.
So almost he had the knowledge there because he'd been a witness to something prior, so...
Yeah, so he kind of had a bit of credibility and kind of saw how it was done, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. So he sounds like he could be a legitimate candidate for us if he was like not that far away, if he was just in Edinburgh.
Yeah, slightly north of Edinburgh at the time. He's a possible candidate, I suppose. But again, he's not kind of well known in the way that we might expect the Newcastle Witchfinder to be. But we're getting a bit warmer, I suppose.
Yeah.
A bit closer to the source.
Yeah. But I suppose the warmest I've gotten so far, if we just want to mention the goods, I suppose, at this point, like the spiciest bit.
Ooh, we like a bit of spice.
So, Ralph Gardner, you mentioned him in the podcast with Joe Bath. So he's the most detailed account we have of the Newcastle Witches and the Newcastle Witchfinder. And he says that after the Witchfinder was exposed as a fraud, that he fled up into Scotland and was pursued by Henry Ogle, tried in a court there and hanged. But I've not been able to back that up with any of the candidates in the list. Mm-hmm. But the closest that there is George Cathy, who was active in 1649 and 1650. He had a female assistant that was an accused witch herself. So he found himself in the court of the Privy Council to deny working with an accused witch in order to detect other witches. He denied that he was working with her. She was burnt and he disappears from records.
Oh.
So, again, we've got a disappearance from records. We don't have George Cathy was hanged for being a witchfinder in Newcastle, like a really detailed account for future historians. There you go.
Yeah.
But we do have the right timeline of him disappearing from records and appearing in court in Scotland for being a witchfinder.
Right, okay.
So it's possible that Ralph Gardner, either because he was getting conflicting information or for, to make his point and write a very sensational kind of report, sort of said, maybe joined two stories of two different witchbreakers and was like, see, they hung him. Could that be the case?
I think that is a possibility, because you have to remember that Gardner was writing 5 years after, and from two eyewitnesses that weren't actually witness to what happened to the witchfinder. And like Joe Bath mentioned, Gardner had a personal vendetta for a very good reason against the council. So it would make the council look a lot worse if they'd hired a fraud on purpose. Well, not hired a fraud on purpose, but if they'd hired a fraud, and Gardner was especially angry that they'd hired a Scottish fraud.
Oh, wow.
It definitely adds that element of poetic justice if the witchfinder was hanged.
Mm-hmm. Shall we go back to George? Is that his name?
George Cathy is
my
main candidate anyway. I'm not saying that we have a definitive answer, but others kind of received a warning or a slap on the wrist. But I think the thing that might detract from it is that Gardner didn't mention Cathy's female assistant.
Right.
I think that if he was aware of it and if he was really going in for the kill of the Newcastle Council, he might have mentioned that.
Yeah.
But I think talking about the female assistant is an important thing to address in witchcraft history, because we get this kind of idea that it's a very binary, rich man versus poor woman.
Yes.
But it's kind of less common to have an accused witch working with you, but there were often female assistants or midwives or a jury of matrons that were employed to look for the devil's mark on the witch's body.
Yes.
So there's much more blurring between the genders in terms of who is a witch and who is a witchfinder.
Yeah.
As a historian, we're kind of used to muddying the waters, I suppose. So, but it's kind of understandable why a more simple binary has come into place. But I think if you're doing a deep dive like this podcast is, I think it's really good to clear up those things. Yeah, and I think it does, looking into it deeper, obviously does make it more understandable. Even not understandable as inexcusable, but when you first are confronted with early modern witchcraft and the trials and the atrocities that are within these records, it seems so alien almost. But when you look at that, the kind of intricacies of it, and in some ways making it kind of relatable in some senses, but then so completely unrelatable and unrecognisable in others, it definitely makes you appreciate the different world that these people inhabited. In the Newcastle Witch Trials as well, they work out that, or they at least have suspicions that the Newcastle Witchfinder was a fraud when he quickly dropped a skirt after pricking her.
Yeah.
And then after the pricking is done, he goes back up into Scotland and they let him go. They hang the witches and then investigate him. So it's not really...
It's almost like they were hedging their bets. They were just saying like, oh, well, we can't call people witches and then let them go, so we'll hang them.
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
And you can kind of see that a little bit in the dialogue that Gardner wrote of the court case anyway. You can see this sort of hedging of bets that might have taken place, because with the alleged witch that the Witchfinder is questioned about, how can she be a witch because she's so personable and godlike? The Witchfinder, according to Gardner, says she is, for the town says she is. So he's kind of saying that he has the mandate of the town's population, and that she is a witch because the people of Newcastle say she's a witch. So once he's kind of ridden off into the sunset back into Scotland, the town's authorities are left with, we think this guy was a fraud, but our subjects want a hanging.
Yeah, because they're not hung straight away, are they?
No. They we think they might have been imprisoned to await the travelling assizes in the summer, because the summer assizes were in Newcastle in around August, and at the end of August is when they were hanged. So they did have this time in between for kind of a further trial process and to decide what they're going to do. But they didn't go and find the Witchfinder or stop the hangings until afterwards. So in England, witchcraft was a felony alongside property theft as a crime as well.
Yeah.
It was kind of on the same footing, whereas in Scotland it was kind of conceived of more spiritually and closer to heresy. So that's why burnings took place in Scotland. But even then, usually people in Scotland had their necks broken before they were burned. Live burnings were very rare.
Yeah.
Again, not a cheery subject. I feel like I'm saying like, at least they were dead when they were burned. But it's
no, we know what you mean.
It is a distinction.
Yeah, there is a bit of a difference there between someone kind of being burnt alive and then being burnt after.
Yeah, and it actually does tell us about how people understood the witch's corpse as well. So the burning was, we think it was actually more to do with purifying the remains and getting rid of the corrupted remains, because there was an understanding that if a witch was buried in a churchyard, then her flesh would corrupt the rest of the corpses. So it was about kind of disposal and purification, as well as the spectacle of the burning. The executions in Newcastle, the witches were hanged alongside moss troopers, which were a form of cattle rustlers or bandits operating along the borders. So it was about kind of the theft of sheep. The people executed alongside alleged witches had just stolen some sheep and some horses.
I did find a quote, and I was assuming it was about that John Dick, saying that they were like a very feared and reputable witchfinder. Was there one John Dick running around, or was there more than one? Because it's a bit.
Well, this is
the
where
records are a bit murky.
I was going to say things get irritating in this sense. So there's a John Dick that was operating in the Highlands that might have been this Cadell or Caldwell John Dick, but there's also like John Dixon or John Dickinson, and we don't know if these are the one in the same or not, unfortunately.
I'm curious to know, sort of, the Witchfinder was it's seemingly such an important role. They were doing this divine work on behalf of society. They were cleansing society of this great evil. Why is there so little information on them? Surely they would be sort of revered and respected, that you would want to document who they were.
So in the cases where we do have information, it often comes from the Witchfinder themselves. So Matthew Hopkins, he wrote A Discovery of Witches in 1647. And that's sometimes seen as his kind of manifesto in a sense, or his way of bragging. But I think by this time it was a defense of his practices, because he was starting to be suspected and caught out as a fraud himself. I'd say that as much as witchfinders were sought after, they weren't really celebrities in the same sense that we see now. So they were just kind of part of the judicial machinery involved in prosecuting a witch at the time. So with the exception of Matthew Hopkins publishing his own text justifying his work, as he was quickly being criticised and suspected of fraud in 1647, we don't really have equivalents of witchfinders wishing to publicise their trade outside of getting a bit more money in the next witch trial. But I think it's plausible that in some cases there was a bit of a cover-up happening. I think this is possible in the Newcastle case, because the Newcastle Witch Trials happened so late into what we'd call the timeline of English witchcraft, happening on like the turn of 1649 to 1650. And then 5 years later, you have Ralph Gardner in his big expose of the way that Newcastle is being run and how corrupt it is to its very core, and him using the scandal of the fraudulent Newcastle Witchfinder as an example of this. And we know kind of right after Gardner's text, England's Grievances Discovered, and then another like paragraph of title, as you have at this time, we know that text was being suppressed. At the time, they were actively trying to stop the circulation of this kind of diatribe against the Newcastle Council. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the more detailed records that perhaps revealed who the Newcastle Witchfinder was were conveniently lost.
Right.
As opposed to being lost centuries later. That's the thing, you can't really extract a single witch hunter, a single witchcraft outbreak from its background and understand it completely there. Everything in early modern life, in the community and the wider community, like other cases in the Northeast at the time, was connected. So we can't talk about the witch trials without talking about Gardner and his own biases and things like that.
Yeah.
So, and the kind of wider pattern of witch hunting happening in the north of England, coinciding with a massive witch hunt outbreak in Scotland at the same time.
Yeah.
So this is kind of around the time that witch finding is slowly fading from the national imagination, I suppose. So there's not really as much time for a legacy to be formed. But also with the Ralph Gardner text and his kind of takedown of the Newcastle City Council when that came out in 1655, that was kind of immediately being suppressed. The councilman didn't want this text to be published and spread about the country. So it's kind of not really a massive leap of the imagination to suggest that maybe these records that might have contained the name of the Witchfinder were conveniently lost rather than damaged centuries later along the way.
A cover-up.
Exactly. So it kind of worked that his identity was protected and lost to time. But you see in kind of other cases in the region that Joe Bath might have mentioned might have also involved the same Witchfinder, they also don't mention him by name. So there is almost a deliberate lack of discussion of him.
It's a deliberate forgetting almost of the person.
Yeah. So there's not really like the celebrity status that, again, people like Hopkins have to this day. This kind of bogeyman, pantomime villain figure didn't really exist at the time and wasn't applied to the Newcastle Witchfinder.
And as much as I would love to know his name just out of curiosity, I'm kind of happy that he isn't really remembered, if that makes any sense. Almost like poetic justice for somebody who was so cruel and so evil that they murdered innocent people.
Yeah, especially as a man that almost, might have set out to create a reputation.
Yeah.
It is satisfying in a sense that we don't know his name. And that's something that I did want to bring up to sort of interrogate why we're so interested in who the Witchfinder is, and perhaps like why other people have claimed to have solved it. Mm-hmm. So we mentioned at the beginning about like names and theories that do pop up. Two of the most irritating ones that pop up, for me anyway, are Thomas Chauville and Cuthbert Nicholson.
Yes.
Some people just say that, the Witchfinder, Cuthbert Nicholson, as everybody knows. Cuthbert Nicholson and Thomas Chauville were the two sergeants that were sent up into Scotland to get the Witchfinder. We know who they were. We know that they weren't the Witchfinders, but there seems to be this need to give him a name. And I think why we're so interested is related to this. It's a kind of Jack the Ripper-like infamy in a way. The fact that we don't know his identity is kind of what makes it a definitely morbid curiosity. When obviously in both cases the victims should be the focus. So we are lucky in a way that we do have the names of the victims. We have little else, but we can memorialise them. But I think that's not to say that it's not important to try and find out who the Newcastle Witchfinder was, because it could help us understand the case in more detail, especially like the Anglo-Scottish connection, like that the region was so in touch with goings on in Scotland that they knew to send for this guy and this specific man, and it tells us that they did want a professional witchfinder. It wasn't this kind of mass panic. We know from this that they had chosen an expert in his field, so they were wanting to
get it right.
Yeah, they wanted to get it right. They wanted to have evidence, as evidence of witch finding existed then. It gives us the kind of same sense of poetic justice that you get with the idea that he might have been caught up for his crimes himself, or similar to like Matthew Hopkins, there's the like common rumour that he was ducked as a witch and lynched. That kind of really took off as a rumour into the 18th and 19th centuries. And that is kind of more, in a way, a sense of justice or retribution than the real story that he just died in a cottage of tuberculosis. Mm-hmm. So you can kind of see that sense of looking for a satisfying conclusion with the story. That's sadly not something you're going to get fully with the Newcastle Witches. If we do trust what Gardner says, and that there was, in a sense, a trial and a public hanging of him, you'd think that someone other than Gardner might have mentioned it somewhere.
No.
But no.
It's nowhere. Thank you for joining us today, Katie, and going over your suspects in your head, who this person might have been, but also just taking us through witch pricking and all the little details of what we do know about the witch pricker, which isn't a lot, but we don't know a lot about these trials in general, and that's what we're trying to discover and find out. So thank you for joining us today.
This episode is sponsored by Escape Key, Newcastle's multi-award-winning escape rooms situated in the historic Gallowgate area of Newcastle. We had the pleasure of playing their immersive witch-themed escape room, which is inspired by the events of the Newcastle Witch Trials of 1649 to 1650. You can book your escape today at www.escape-key.co.uk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Newcastle Witches Podcast. I'm Maria.
And I'm Caitlin.
If you want to find out more about what we spoke about in this episode and past or future episodes, you can find us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter by searching for the Newcastle Witches Podcast. And there's also a dedicated page linking and profiling the many guests we have on the podcast. It's candleandbell.com/Newcastle Witches. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us for the next episode of the Newcastle Witches Podcast.